Spanning the globe, it's World Affairs Roundup.
The Institute of World Affairs at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee presents World Affairs Roundup, a monthly edition of International Focus, providing opinion and analysis of global events, with John Katzka, a retired member of the U.S. Foreign Service, Ann Hamilton, political scientist at UW-Whitewater, who also served in the U.S. Foreign Service, and Robert Kraig, executive director of Citizen Action of Wisconsin and author of articles and books on American foreign policy. Support provided by Milwaukee Public Television and the UWM Center for International Education. Now, here's your moderator, Doug Savage.
Welcome to International Focus and another edition of our World Affairs Roundup. Our Roundup regulars have assembled once again to take a look at Guilty. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia has sentenced Radovan Karadzic to 40 years in prison for his role in the Srebrenica genocide and other acts of ethnic cleansing during the 1992 to 1995 Bosnian War. What impact will his conviction have on survivors of this conflict and more generally on the international justice system? The liberator of Palmyra. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is casting the liberation of the historic ISIS-held city by government forces as proof his regime is the indispensable partner in combating terrorism. Will he succeed in his campaign to be seen as the lesser of two evils? Deserting Dilma. Leaders of Brazil's largest party announced this week they're leaving President Dilma Rousseff's governing coalition. As her coalition crumbles, odds of Ms. Rousseff's impeachment greatly increase. Already facing scandal, economic crisis, and the Zika virus, how will Brazil cope with impending political paralysis? And Rangoon Reset. More than 50 years of military rule in Burma officially ended this week as Tin Chaw, a longtime ally of Nobel laureate Aung San Suu Kyi, was sworn in as president. What lies ahead for the new civilian government? Well, welcome back, everyone. And John, we can start in your former stomping grounds of Bosnia, Serbia. What happened this week?
Well, what we know so far is that Radovan Karadzic, who was the former president of the Serb enclave in Bosnia, Herzegovina, was convicted of genocide and war crimes. We also know, with new information, that a man named Seychelles, who was also indicted by the tribunal, was not. It was released because of a lack of evidence.
So walk us through just the dynamics of that conflict. I mean, Yugoslavia broke up, and what happened?
Well, let's go a step before that. 1984, an important date in the annals of American diplomatic history. The date I was assigned to Belgrade as the first Secretary of Embassy. What I found when I arrived was a country that had, it was 4 years after Marshal Tito's death, but this was a country that was afraid to move forward. They were still working under the model that he presented to them of a rotating leadership. And part of the reason for that was that Tito had created a pressure cooker of the ethnic animosities that had gone back for centuries. And he cut that off mostly against the Serbs because he was a Croat and the Serbs were the largest group, and they were punished more under his rule than the other groups. But all of them were punished, and all of them were resentful, and we were waiting for something to happen, and Milosevic started the process. Tudjman in Croatia participated in it. Izetbegovic in Bosnia participated in it. But we were more comfortable with just one bad guy because it's more complicated when you get three bad guys in the process. And so we supported we were against Milosevic, and then this really turned ugly. And the Serbs were guilty of this, but there was genocide on all accounts. There was genocide in Croatia against Serbs. There was genocide in in Kosovo against Serbs. There was genocide in Kosovo against Albanians. It was going on all over the place.
So, what was Bosnia like before and now? I mean, what did these proceedings 20 years afterwards yield?
Well, it depends on who you talk to. I mean, there's still a lot of animosity, I think, in some of the villages in particular. Some of the, I think less so in the cities. I mean, in some places you hear that for example, Shelev, who John was just talking about, he's portrayed as an ultranationalist. He's now, he was actually in Serbia. He wasn't before the court when he was acquitted because he had been let go for cancer, but he's participating in politics, pursuing his ultranationalist causes. But he doesn't have a lot of support apparently on the ground. But in some of the in the more rural areas, you tend to have a lot of the animosity still there. And so there's a lot of hasn't changed in the culture.
But also the countryside, the whole country, which was never a country before, the whole country is divided into enclaves.
As a result of Dayton, right? And
well,
before,
even
too.
before,
yeah,
because that's how they were living.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the Russian component of this. The Russian response was that this was settling scores and selective justice. Would you expect anything else?
Unfortunately not, though we don't hear the Russians calling for having broader justice or prosecuting anyone else. It's just that you can't prosecute a major Serbian war criminal because they're allied with Russia. So obviously they see human rights in this fashion as just an instrument of NATO and the United States in a battle for ideas where they may have that component to some degree, but this is also driven by, what really came out of World War II, the idea that if you don't have a comeuppance based on an accounting of what happened, then you never learn from history. There's a lot of concern that this hasn't done that you're talking about a very dense report, not been translated into the languages spoken in Bosnia or in the former Yugoslavia at all, and being politicized right away, where your position on it is based on global politics, not based on what actually happened. There's little doubt this is a war criminal. There are other war criminals too, as John pointed out, but there needs to be some accounting if we're ever going to stigmatize war crimes, especially as we see what's going on in Syria right now, which is going to be another major area for an international tribunal in the future, one would hope.
But if I could find an expression that covers how the people there are looking at this, it's from a young woman, and I'm not sure where she is from, but I think it could come from any of the ethnic groups. We do not have peace, but peace accords among warring parties. Nothing is over there.
So is there anything, just stepping back and looking at this process more broadly, how could more substantive reconciliation have occurred? Is it the fault of the process in some way, or is it just some conflicts are so deeply entrenched and woven into the fabric that it takes much longer than any process could effectively accomplish?
Don't you have to lose in order to be able to move forward? And there was no loser in this particular thing. It was a stalemate that all parties could walk away from, feeling that their positions were still maintainable.
I mean, obviously I was just critical of the Russian position, but there's truth in the fact that all sides have to admit fault in order to have reconciliation. So it is problematic that the only major prosecution is of a Serbian war criminal, even if he is the worst.
Well, and Tudjman was prosecuted after an indictment was against him, but he was already dead. So it took a long time for that one to make its way through.
I also think there's a period in history here. I mean, in order for the tribunal to be set up, the Russians had to agree to it. It was right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it was created by the Security Council. And there was a brief moment there where it looked like they were trying to bring the parties together and come up with some way of at least bringing people accountable. But now we're in a different era in terms of the way the Russians are viewing the whole process. And it's clear that they're not doing anything to help contribute to reconciliation, I don't think.
Well, let's look at another theater in which the Russians are playing a role. the Syria and the city of Palmyra. Now, it was in ISIS hands since May of 2015. Now it looks like, if not government forces, militias aligned with the government have taken it back. Is this a good thing?
It's sort of like the last question. It depends on who you talk to. I personally see, a lot of people are saying that it's good because, even Ban Ki-moon came out and said he was happy that Palmyra was back in the hands of Assad. But obviously, for those who are interested in antiquities, it's a good thing and obviously a lot of people are interested in antiquities. And ISIS is a brutal group. But I don't think that it bodes well for a quick end and an ending to the civil war that will actually lead to some kind of reconciliation. It spells more time in power for Assad, and I think that's not such a good thing.
Well, Boris Johnson, London's mayor, who opines on these situations, said no matter how repulsive the Assad regime may be, and it is, their opponents in the Islamic State are far, far worse. So is that the lens through which we should view this?
Probably not. There's it seems like the dominant narrative right now is that it's really part of Assad's strategy. To say, in essence, that I'm the only bulwark against terrorism. In fact, there are many who believe that he allowed ISIS to grow in part of the country in order to create that kind of dichotomy, and that both allowing them to take Palmyra and then taking it back are all part of that strategy. And so if you believe that, then anything that strengthens him, and this is what Ann was referring to, actually makes the situation worse. And most of the killing has been done by Assad and his armies, not by ISIS, as repulsive and reprehensible as ISIS is. And that ties into, of course, the American kind of paranoid reaction where we're seeing a couple terrorist acts, a large number of terrorist acts, which are not nearly as, haven't killed nearly as many people as Assad has, as kind of terrorizing our political culture into we must stop ISIS, there's nothing else going on, and not taking a step back and understanding the ultimate roots of the conflict, and also not realizing that unless we have a real international settlement in Syria, the refugee crisis continues, and that is destabilizing economically and politically in Europe.
So, John, what about the Russian angle on all of this? There was the abrupt pullout.
Pull back.
Or pull, fair enough, pull back. But it seems as if the U.S. has kind of been maneuvered into a position where certainly that case could be made, that it really is the lesser of two evils, and would you rather deal with ISIS or Assad? Was that part of the calculus on Moscow's part, do you think?
I think it was to give Assad a strong enough base to go into negotiations. But I also think it is related to Ukraine and the sanctions and Russia's position internationally. Quite frankly, Russia looked convincing and adroit in terms of dealing with Syria, much more so than we have been up to this point.
So just a minute or so before we go to our break, and to your point, can there be a comprehensive settlement, do you think, while the regime is still in place?
Well, they're proceeding forward with negotiations. Assad has rejected the idea of, he's saying they're going to rewrite their own constitution, have their own elections, sort of ignoring the whole process that the UN is trying to set up. And now he is not really even negotiating, but coming in from a position of much greater strength. So it doesn't bode very well for the opposition, which is already very split. So, don't know.
What worries me about this is the unintended consequences, the chaos that is likely to happen should Assad fall. We are putting so much support for the opposition here, which we know very little about, and I just find that a very troubling kind of situation.
Well, we'll make our way to a different hemisphere shortly, but first we'll take a short break. We'll be right back.
The Institute of World Affairs presents our community with a range of public programs relating to global issues, U.S. foreign policy, and the world economy. For more information about the Institute of World Affairs, call 414-229-3220 or visit our website at www.iwa.uwm.edu.
Welcome back. Now let's take up an issue a bit closer to home in Brazil. Robert, what happened this week?
Well, I mean, the Brazilian government is coming apart, basically. The largest party in the coalition government has pulled out. And this is all part of a big corruption scandal, or a consequence of it, called, the English translation is the car wash. So it's their version of Watergate, but worse. And so it turns out that, I mean, it's not a shock that Brazilian political culture is highly corrupt, and that you actually have a lot more of the private sector that is actually public sector, a lot more public ownership of major industries, and there are huge kickbacks involved that are enriching. I mean, literally a third of the legislative body is been indicted. Now, whether or not they're actually going to, apparently the timelines are such that the Supreme Court may not be able to handle all of these indictments, but nonetheless,
which is already behind schedule.
Yes, but so it's nonetheless a problem. But this is unraveling the Workers' Party, which was incredibly successful under Lula da Souza, and he has been brought back now as chief of staff for his political brilliance, which also has been criticized as a move to immunize him from potential prosecution. And this is, Brazil had unparalleled boom years in the aughts, and they also undertook really what is a model anti-poverty program to try to deal with the massive historic poverty and economic inequality in Brazil, and it made major progress, and therefore the Workers' Party is still highly popular among the mass numbers of poor and mostly people of color in Brazil, but it's the middle class, the whiter part of the country, that has been rising up. And so under the new constitution, I mean, by our standards, it's 30 years old, I think. There are all sorts of ways that the prime minister can be removed, unlike in the United States. And so there are all sorts of speculation. It's a parlor game of whether she be removed. She is not personally implicated at this point. It's her party and most of the major officials and most of the legislature. And so this is a major moment where you could have a real swing to the right in Brazil, because it's the opposition to the right that stands to benefit from the crumbling of this regime. And the question is whether Lula has one great political move left in him, I mean, in terms of Machiavellian tactics to keep the Workers' Party in the saddle.
Well, and what about this? I mean, is it straight garden variety corruption, or is there a sort of class component to this? I mean, certainly the Workers' Party is perceived as looking out for the interest of the disenfranchised that Robert spoke about. And some of the antagonists of Dilma Rousseff are certainly from other parties. So how much of that is there in all of this? Or is it really just about corruption?
I think that a lot of it is just about corruption. I mean, honestly, and especially about the political class. And, it's just sort of been business as usual for a very long time, only it's gotten a lot worse. I think that there's definitely a class element to it, but there was a lot of money going around when oil was at a very high price, and Brazil was when they're talking about the extreme wealth in when Brazil was just getting the Olympics, they had the World Cup, they were going into high tech, all sorts of oil exploration, and it's the 6th largest economy in the world, and they were really doing very, very well. So there was a lot of money going around, and I think it just was a little bit more of too much of a good thing. One of the problems now facing Brazil, I mean, these scandals have been going on, and the calls for her impeachment, I mean, it's actually, the proceedings were started by the head of the lower house, who's also been indicted, which makes the process a little bit more difficult, and accused of a lot of corruption. And but if you read a lot in the Brazilian news, they're all saying, but who are we going to have? And the only real option, I think, is the military, and they're talking more about the military now, but that would be catastrophic in a country which is just actually beginning to deal with its military past in terms of coming out and talking about what happened under that regime. So it's a difficult time because there aren't many alternatives.
Well, and why this matters is you made reference to the sixth largest economy. They became the sixth largest economy by nosing out the UK. So I mean, we're talking about an economy on the scale of,
Sure.
Great Britain. So, John, talk a little bit about some of the other challenges then beyond just this political paralysis. And it should be said, were she to be impeached, there's an automatic 180-day period where essentially nothing can happen. Where
Well, an impeachment is not a conviction, it's a trial.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, just because she's impeached, we know that from our recent history, don't we?
Mm-hmm. But, we've got other things in the works, obviously. We've got the Zika virus, which is, according to the WHO, explosively spreading across the country. And there's the small matter of hosting the Olympics in just really a few months' time. So, could not have come at a worse time, I suppose, is the takeaway to that.
Well, let me add one thing to Rousseff and her, how she got there. I mean, in 2010, when she was running for the presidency, she was not the top person in the Workers' Party. All the others had been implicated in previous scandals. So this is...
She wasn't even a politician. She was
Right,
an
exactly
administrator,
right.
actually in the oil company.
Right.
So,
And her, from what I have read, she doesn't appear to be greedy in terms of what she's grabbing. Now, I don't know what greed, how that translates in Portuguese, but
Well, let's move back over to the other hemisphere and to Burma or Myanmar, which set out on a historic path, we hope. So, what happened? We have a new president sworn in. Talk a little bit about the context of that. Any one of you like to jump in?
Well, I mean, there was a long period of military rule back to 1962. There had been a long-term protest movement, mostly peaceful. And actually, there was a false start in 1990 where there was an election, and the military still refused to give over power. Now they've finally done so, but they did ace out the leader of the whole movement.
Right. So the name
yeah.
most people associate
Yes.
with Myanmar or Burma, of course, is Aung San Suu Kyi.
Right. But Suu Kyi, she is not the prime minister because they said you could not have a foreign husband or children who are foreign citizens, and hers are, so it seems to be a constitutional provision created by the military. And so one of her closest friends and allies back to school days is now in charge.
well, she's also the foreign minister and has three
Yes.
other portfolios as
Right.
well. So, I mean, it's not that she's on the sidelines here.
Right, and the military is still there in that the military
25%
put in a required 25% of parliament, and that blocks any constitutional changes. So it's very tenuous. There isn't a deep civil society here. It's embryonic, and there's a lot of concern about whether it's getting enough support, especially from other Asian countries, in building it up. And then the military is far from gone.
Well, and if you look next door in Thailand, which is wrestling with its own democracy, and has a military authority in charge, there's not going to be a lot of support.
Right.
So what are some of the challenges beyond just getting the military out of the way? Talk a little bit about the ethnic divisions in the country.
well, there are many recognized ethnic groups. I think something like 135. We've been reading about the issues involved with the Rohingya Muslim group, which is over 1 million people who aren't even recognized, who there are allegations of genocide against them. A lot of them have been trying to leave the country, and apparently Aung San Suu Kyi has not been, reaching out to them as an ethnic group. A number of the ethnic groups during the elections ended up, I think somewhat surprisingly, voting for her and instead of other ethnic-based candidates. But that could change pretty quickly. As the new government, they've been in the opposition. I mean, in these transitions to democracy after many years of military rule, there's always this somewhat usually pretty short period of euphoria until those who are now ruling have to start making the hard choices and inevitably begin alienating certain groups. So they have a really hard hard road ahead of them.
Talk a little bit about, Robert, you touched on this, the regional context. I think only Mr. Modi from India called to congratulate her.
Yeah.
I mean, have the rest of their neighbors been a bit...
Well, if you look at Malaysia, I mentioned Thailand, and I spent 71 to 76 in Thailand watching as this was developing, and really need to focus on the fact that in the northern part of the country, that is generally ungoverned. Those are hill tribes peoples up there who fight against each other, and if the military go in, they get a bloody nose usually. So this is ungoverned in the northern part of Burma.
So is there a Chinese connection to this, as there often is in a story in Asia? You know, I mean, are they perceived as potentially being yet another...
It depends upon how much they become involved. I can remember Japan becoming very involved in Southeast Asia in the early 70s, and at the beginning it was okay, but they got very aggressive about it, and it wasn't okay.
Well, we'll have to leave it at that. To our panel, thank you once again. To our viewers, see you next time.
For information about the Institute of World Affairs and its many programs, or to become a member of the Institute, call 414-229-3220 or visit us at our website,